Welcome, everybody. We got our first throwdown, ladies and gentlemen, of the new year of 2023. And it is a supersized throwdown because for the first time ever, we're going to be putting 3 records against each other. And as I always say, some of the best ideas come from you, the audience. And this initial throwdown idea came from a listener. And again, I apologize. I don't write people's names down that call in with this stuff, but you know who you are, so thank you. Because somebody said you got to do Kiss Destroyer versus Rock and Roll Over. And then I got an email and somebody said, why don't you expand it and do all 3 of those classic 70s records against each other? And I didn't know how that would work to do 3 records, but bottom line is we're putting 3 into the pot today, and you have to pick one of these 3 records, which is your favorite or the best. And those records are 3 records made by Kiss at the height of their popularity. Really what many Kiss fans consider to be the golden age of the band, inarguably the most popular, biggest time for the band, a time where the band was actually ranked at one point as the most popular band in the world, and a time that just spans 2 years, 1976 and 1977. And the records we're talking about today are Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, and Love Gun, released in that order. And if you're around my age, in your mid-50s, I mean, this was, this puts you right back in there in that golden period where, you're in your teens, your early teens, and this was your life, for me and so many other people. So we're going to pull these records apart. I'm going to give you the tale of the tape as I do when we usually do the throwdowns, and then we're going to get right to the phones and hear from you on your pick. And at the end of this show, we'll have a consensus as to who the winner is out of these 3 records. And I'm really curious to see how this all plays out, and I have some thoughts that I'll give you as well along the way. Real quickly, because I want to spend almost the whole show on this throwdown today and your calls. But real quickly, news stuff today. The major news, without question, is, and I talked about this, Foo Fighters. To me, it was laughable when people were thinking, well, the Foo Fighters, are they going to continue? Of course they were going to continue. They put out a statement recently saying they're continuing, and they are now already officially announced for shows in America, headlining many of the major rock festivals this summer, all of those Danny Wimmer Presents festivals. Expect to see Foo Fighters on many of them, if not all of them, including already announced today, the lineup for Sonic Temple, which happens in Columbus, Ohio, returning to that city, that event returning, and that'll be happening Memorial Weekend, 4 nights, May 25 through 28. Massive bands headlining at Crew Stadium include the Foo Fighters, Tool, Avenged Sevenfold, and Kiss. Another band that's never ending. Right across the top, those are your 4 headlining bands closing out that festival. The other co-headlining bands include Godsmack, who will be making a big run this year on the back of a new album, which they say will be their last. Rob Zombie, already talked about it. Zombie, the king of these festivals, probably has been doing them the longest and most consistently on almost every single one. And this will be significant for Zombie, that these will be the first time in a while playing these events without guitarist John Five, who of course has left for Motley Crue. Also on the Sonic Temple event, Queens of the Stone Age, Deftones, and a shit ton of other bands over the course of the 4 days. Again, Memorial Weekend in Columbus, Ohio. But the Foo Fighters angle is most interesting here because a lot of the usual suspects on these festivals, but Foo Fighters not only doing that, but they're already announced to be a part of 2 unrelated festivals. By unrelated, I mean done by different companies. So you can already see a theme here early on in this first 10 days of 2023. Not only are Foo Fighters continuing, but they will be everywhere, and they will be likely headlining every single festival of every genre you could imagine. Because the other 2 festivals they were announced on today to be headlining are not rock festivals. Sonic Temple is rock top to bottom. The other 2 are not. But when you're a band as big as Foo Fighters and as revered as Foo Fighters, you can be put on any festival with any types of bands around you, and they will make it work. To that end, Foo Fighters also will be one of the headliners on a festival called Boston Calling, which interestingly also happens Memorial Weekend. They'll be playing on the 26th of May, so they'll go from that over to Columbus. So in one weekend, one holiday weekend, they'll knock out two major festivals, one in Boston, one in Columbus, Ohio. And also Foo Fighters announced to be a headliner on Bonnaroo, which happens just outside of Nashville, June 15th through 18th. So by far the big news today is we already knew Foo Fighters were not going anywhere, but now already announced on 3 different rock festivals, or actually 1 rock festival and 2 music festivals coming up very soon, in months. And no announcement as to who the drummer will be to replace Taylor Hawkins. We will see as it rolls out. I'm sure we will be getting an announcement on that soon. My money's on Rufus Taylor. I don't know anything on the inside. It's just speculation and knowing what I know and based on, my thoughts, but anything's possible. We'll see when it gets officially announced, but they've already been announced on the dates, and the photo that they're using right now does not picture a drummer. So they're not revealing anything as far as who's going to be playing. What else? Jonathan Cain making a statement that he will indeed be touring with Journey. We've been covering this Journey drama, and it's significant drama. Journey has a show, their first show of the year, scheduled for February 4th in Allentown, Pennsylvania, less than a month away. That Journey are about to kick off another run of dates amidst major drama within the band. Is it conceivable that Jonathan Cain and Neil Schon are going to be on stage playing music together in the middle of lawsuits and all this craziness? Entirely possible, because the gig's the gig. There's tons of bands that play every night on stage and hate each other. Because when they walk off the stage, they got to pay the bills and they want that paycheck. So, anything's possible. Hopefully things will be resolved by the time they've got to play together. But Jonathan Cain says, yeah, I'm playing. I'm in the band. So that's interesting. The countdown to the first show, which will be something to watch. And really the only other thing, major birthday today, because it's a major artist, Rod Stewart, 78 years old today. Mentioned Jimmy Page was 79 yesterday. Some of these really iconic guys, the rock royalty, if you will, now getting close to 80. And you got to cherish whatever they give you at this point in their career. Okay, so that's it as far as news. I just want to get through a couple big things real quick because we want to pivot to the throwdown. Let me give you the tale of the tape on these 3 records. So you've got Destroyer in order the way they came out. Destroyer coming off of the heels of Kiss Alive, the live album, which chronicled the first 3 studio records, but was significant because it broke the band. So we all know Kiss broke off of Kiss Alive. That's when they saved their career, and that's where everything changed for them. So Destroyer, a super significant record because it was the first studio record after they became a household name. Also significant in the sense that Bob Ezrin produced it, coming off of his work with Alice Cooper. Famously, Ezrin put a whole different polish on the band, really worked the band hard to hone their craft, to be better musicians, better singers, brought in outside musicians, brought in symphonies, had a hand in the writing of the songs. Ezrin really took the band into a whole nother world. Destroyer is widely considered to be the all-time classic Kiss studio record. It's arguable, and that's what we're going to do today, but to the general public, Destroyer is the record, right? What I don't think people realize is when Destroyer initially came out, coming off the heels of Alive, it was not well received by Kiss fans who had loved the band and fallen in love with the band because of Alive, because it was so different, it was so polished, it wasn't that very raw band that they had seen live. All of a sudden, this band took on a whole different thing. Over time, that quickly changed, and Destroyer was obviously widely accepted, and to this day probably includes more songs in the band's set list than any other record, and is, like I said, universally considered to be the all-time classic Kiss studio record. The record came out March 15th, 1976. There were 4 singles released from Destroyer. Shout It Out Loud was the initial single released March 1st, 1976. I had no idea God of Thunder was released as a single only 2 weeks later. Flaming Youth released as a single April 30th of 76. And then famously, Detroit Rock City released as a single in July 28th of 76. The flip side of Detroit Rock City was a song called Beth, which was put on there because they figured nobody on the planet is going to want to hear from a hard rock band doing a symphony song with the drummer singing. Somebody flips the record over. Beth becomes a massive hit out of nowhere across multiple formats, and Detroit Rock City becomes the B-side. So it's interesting, and I'm looking at Wikipedia. Detroit Rock City released July 28th, 76. Beth released August 76. All they did was change the label. And they made Beth the A-side and Detroit Rock City the B-side when it was initially the other way, because one radio DJ decided to play the other side of the 45, and that's the song that took off. And Beth is the biggest song from the record, without a doubt, which doesn't even include anybody on the band from it, but Peter Criss singing it, because it's Ezrin and it's orchestration. Few other stats on Destroyer: legendary classic album cover by the late Ken Kelly. A total of, if you count the weird untitled piece at the end that's a minute and a half long, which doesn't have a title, it's 10 songs, really 9, because that thing at the end is just weird and who knows. It says it's that song's all that, according to Wikipedia, that song is known as Rock and Roll Demons or Rock and Roll Party. What else can I tell you about Destroyer you don't even know? Of course, all 3 of these records made with the original lineup of the band: Ace, Peter, Gene, Paul. Sales-wise on Destroyer, now keep this in mind, Kiss has not had their catalog recertified. What I mean by that is this tabulation could be from 30 years ago and not factor in streaming or sales of the last 30 years. Because in order to recertify a record's sales, you have to pay for it. And for whatever reason, their catalog has not been recertified. So I don't know where this stat comes from, but according to the stats that I have in front of me, to date, Destroyer has sold certified over 2 million copies. I venture to say it's probably closer to 4 million now, but it just hasn't been updated. I'd say you could probably double all these sales numbers, given that it's probably been 30 years since they recertified them. And what else can I tell you? Top chart position for Destroyer in America was number 11. So the record peaked on the Billboard Top 200 at number 11. 4 singles released, the highest charting by far, Beth at number 7. Shout It Out Loud charting us at number 31 on the Billboard Pop chart. So there's Destroyer. Rock and Roll Over comes out a few months later, because back in these days, Kiss released a record every 6 months. Rock and Roll Over released November 11th, same year, 1976, known for being predominantly recorded live and not working with Ezrin. Always really interesting to me that Kiss decided to go with a different producer coming off of Destroyer, which was without a doubt, an enormous record. But that was an absolute reaction to the fact that they knew that a lot of their fan base did not like Destroyer, even though it crossed over and became such a big record, because it was so different sounding from Alive. So the next album, Rock and Roll Over, they bring the guy who produced Alive, Eddie Kramer, in, and they record a studio record essentially live to recapture that raw vibe in Nanuet, New York, at a place called the Star Theater. A complete 180 to what they did on Destroyer. Bring in Eddie Kramer, who's known for a very live sound, record basically live in a theater to tape, and put it out. Rock and Roll Over, also a tremendously classic album cover done by an artist by the name of Michael Dorette, I believe is how you pronounce his name. Rock and Roll Over had 2 singles released from it. Hard Luck Woman, the very Rod Stewart sounding track, released November 1st, 1976, sung by Peter Criss, written by Paul Stanley. And the follow-up single, Calling Dr. Love, released February 13th of 77. Only 2 singles released from the record. Chart-wise, the album, like Destroyer, peaked at number 11, which is interesting. Sales-wise, in terms of certification, half the albums of Destroyer did 1 million platinum, although, again, I think by today's standard and what's happened since certification, you could probably say this record has done easily 2 million. Hard Luck Woman hit number 15 on the pop charts, Calling Dr. Love number 16. Interesting that with Rock and Roll Over, this just hit me. Neither of the 2 singles sung by Paul Stanley, who of course sung the bulk of the singles released from Kiss Records. Hard Luck Woman sung by Peter, Calling Dr. Love sung by Gene. I remember as a kid hearing Calling Dr. Love on pop radio, and it was wild to be 12 and hear that on Top 40 radio, but I did. So there's your story on Rock and Roll Over. To the hardcore Kiss fans, probably considered to be the greatest studio record, and I would probably fall in on that as well. And then you move to the third album in this trio, and that would be Love Gun. And Love Gun was released on June 30th, 1977. 2 singles released from Love Gun, Christine 16, insanely perverted song. Talk about hearing something crazy on pop radio. Gene with that, I saw you coming out of school that day. I had to have you. I mean, whew, you get canceled for that today. June 1st, 77, Christine 16, followed up July 31st, 77 by the title track Love Gun. So 1 Gene, 1 Paul as the 2 singles released from these records. Love Gun also certified at 1 million copies, probably at least 2 million now. Love Gun significant because it was the first time anybody ever heard Ace Frehley sing on the Kiss classic Shock Me. And interestingly, Love Gun on the Billboard charts peaked higher than either Destroyer or Rock and Roll Over. Love Gun peaked at number 4. Maybe the highest charting Kiss record before all the stuff changed with the charts. And what that's a byproduct of really is the fact that between Alive, Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, by this point, Kiss was ranked as the biggest band in the world. This is TV movies and commercials and 3 nights in arenas. So needless to say, the studio record released around that time was going to benefit. This is the peak. This followed with Alive 2, which was the next record to come, the peak of Kiss hysteria. And same deal, 10 tracks on the record, and there's a cover on this record. There's not a cover on the other 2, but there is a cover on this record, a cover of a song originally done by the Crystals, which was called Then He Kissed Me, that they changed to Then She Kissed Me. That closes the record. Otherwise, it's all original material, the other 9 tracks. So there you have it. It's like 3 studio records in the course of like 18 months. Destroyer, Rock and Roll Over, Love Gun. What's the one for you? Now, I know myself, I can say this being a Kiss fan, and I know many of you as well, if you are a Kiss fan, obviously will say you love all 3 records. There's got to be one that means more to you than any other. And I'll start it off right now and tell you that my pick is Rock and Roll Over. I've always said when I've had to pick a favorite Kiss studio record, I've always picked that record. And it doesn't mean that I don't love the other two, because I do. But Love Gun with the cover song at the end, and I don't know. I mean, again, it's so hard, but I'm throwing, just Rock and Roll Over means everything to me. Rock and Roll Over, when I got it, it was, so Destroyer was the first Kiss record I ever got. But at the time I got it, Rock and Roll Over was the new record. And I remember clearly walking home from middle school in 76. So again, I would have been 12. I probably would have been 12. Walking home from middle school, walking by a record store with my best friend at the time. We go in the record store, as we often did on our way home, walking home from school. And he said, I'm buying a record by this band called Kiss. And I'd never heard of them. And he said to me, I said, well, really? I go, what are they about? And we went to the bin. It's crazy because I remember this like it was yesterday, and I don't remember things from that period all that well. But we went in, we go to the bin. He filed through to the K's, found the little card, Kiss. He pulled out the record, and he pulled out Rock and Roll Over. And he said, this is the record I'm buying. It just came out. And I said, well, I'd like to check that band out too. He goes, well, this is the new record. I haven't heard it, so I don't know if it's any good. If you're going to start with them, you should probably get the previous record because that one is really good. And I said, well, what's that called? And he said, Destroyer. So I said, okay, you get the new one. I'm going to get the one before, since you know that you're telling me that's good. So that day, he bought Rock and Roll Over. He had already had Destroyer. I bought Destroyer. The next day, I was asking my parents for money to go back to the record store and get Destroyer. And then the originals, and then Alive, and then, you know, the same insanity and obsession that every other kid my age took hold of me. So for me, although Rock and Roll Over was not my first, when I listen to it today, it's the most indicative of Kiss. It's raw, it's live, top to bottom, not a clunker on it as far as the songs. It's still my go-to Kiss studio record. So by a hair over Destroyer and by a hair over Love Gun, I cast the first vote today, and I pick Rock and Roll Over for the reasons I just stated. Let's take our first break, give you a chance to digest everything I just threw at you. And when we come back, Mr. Speed, are you kidding me? Oh, this is beyond great. All right, we'll be right back, and we'll get into it with you on the phones next.